Enzo Ferrari was handed $18 million. He looked at the contract and walked out. That moment, one man, one decision, one clause on one page, triggered a chain of events that would humiliate the most celebrated car brand on the planet, rob one of motorsport's greatest drivers of his rightful place in history, and eventually force Enzo Ferrari to give away the company he had spent his entire life building. This is that story. You need to understand one thing about Enzo Ferrari before any of this makes sense. He did not care about cars. Not really. Not the way you and I do. What Enzo cared about, the only thing he ever truly cared about, was racing. The road cars were a means to an end. Every Ferrari ever sold to a wealthy man with a garage in Monaco or a villa in Tuscany existed for one purpose: to put money into the race team. Enzo tolerated those customers. He needed their money, but he had no real interest in them. Racing was his religion. Scuderia Ferrari, the race team, was his church, and he was not going to let anyone else stand at the altar. By 1963, though, the money was getting tight. The road car business wasn't generating enough to keep pace with what serious motorsport demanded. Enzo was caught in a trap of his own making. He needed to keep racing to maintain the prestige that made people buy the road cars. But the road cars weren't making enough to fund the racing. The gap was widening. Something had to give. So Enzo did something that shocked people close to him. He opened the door to outside investment. He was willing to sell. On the other side of the Atlantic, Henry Ford II was having his own problems. Ford had just come through the Edsel, a car so catastrophically misunderstood by the market that it became the dictionary definition of a corporate failure. Sales were flat. The company felt stale. Henry Ford II, the grandson of the man who built the assembly line, who had inherited an empire and was determined not to lose it, wanted to change the conversation. He wanted Ford to mean something to a new generation, something exciting, something with a European edge and a racing pedigree. Buying Ferrari solved everything at once. Ford sent Lee Iacocca to Italy, one of the sharpest minds Detroit had ever produced. Iacocca brought Don Frey with him to handle the negotiations directly. Secret meetings ran through the early months of 1963, numbers going back and forth, terms being shaped, both sides moving closer. By spring, the deal was almost done. Ford's own archivist, Ted Ryan, described it later. They had a final agreement. Enzo had approved it. They were at the table with the pen in hand, and he backed out at the last second. The reason was a single clause. Ford would control Ferrari's racing budget. That was it. That was all it took. For any normal businessman, that clause is unremarkable. You sell your company, the buyer controls the money. That's commerce. But Enzo Ferrari looked at that clause and saw something different. He saw Ford deciding which races Scuderia Ferrari would enter. Ford approving the development budget for next year's car. Ford executives in suits sitting in his paddock, telling his engineers what they could and couldn't spend. He saw the end of the only thing he had ever cared about. He stood up. He left the table. He went and had lunch. Ford's delegation flew back to Detroit with nothing. Months of negotiations, millions in preparation costs, and a deal that had been within a signature of completion. Gone. And then, within weeks, Enzo sold a stake in Ferrari to Fiat instead, an Italian company, on Enzo's terms, with the racing division untouched and firmly in his own hands. There are historians who believe Enzo orchestrated the whole thing, that he used Ford's interest as leverage to extract a better offer from Fiat, that there was never going to be a signature, that he sat across from Ford's delegation for months, watching them sharpen their pencils, knowing he was going to walk. Whether that's true, only Enzo knew. What is true is the response it produced. Henry Ford II was not a man who accepted being played. He called his team into a room and gave an order that has since passed into automotive legend. Go to Le Mans and beat his ass. Le Mans. If you know anything about motorsport, you know what it means. If you don't, here's the short version. 24 hours, one circuit, drivers swapping in shifts through the day, through the night, through whatever the French summer decides to throw at them. It is not a sprint. It is not even a marathon. It is something closer to an endurance test of everything: engineering, strategy, preparation, and nerve. The car has to survive things no road car ever faces and do it at racing speed for a full day. Ferrari owned it. 5 wins in 6 years going into 1964. The red cars were practically untouchable on home soil in front of European crowds who treated them like a national institution. Ford had never won it once. 1964. Ford enters 3 GT40S. All 3 break down before the finish. Ferrari wins. 1965. Ford doubles the entry. 6 cars on the grid. More money, more preparation. Every single one retires. Ferrari wins again. 6 consecutive Le Mans victories. Ford has now spent 2 full seasons and a fortune, and has nothing except the growing suspicion that they have made a very expensive mistake. Something had to change completely. Ford brought in Carroll Shelby. If you don't know Shelby, a Texan, a former racing driver, a man who had already built the AC Cobra with Ford and terrified everyone who drove it. Shelby had an instinct for building fast things out of limited resources and an absolute refusal to treat the word impossible as final. Ford gave him the GT40 and told him to fix it. Shelby didn't fix it. He rebuilt it from the ground up. The engine came out. In went a 7-liter V8 derived from NASCAR. Not the most powerful engine available, but built for the kind of sustained punishment Le Mans demanded. Over 480 horsepower. Everything that had failed in 1964 and 1965 was identified, stripped out, and redesigned. The new car was called the GT40 Mark II, and Ford's preparation for 1966 was unlike anything endurance racing had seen. A dedicated Le Mans committee, months of pre-race testing, 2 teams running parallel development programs in controlled competition with each other. Ferrari entered 2 cars. 2. After 5 straight victories. They were not afraid of Ford. That confidence was about to age very badly. June 1966. Le Mans. Ford brought 8 GT40 Mark IIs, 8 cars. It wasn't a race entry, it was an occupation. The race ran. Hours passed. The night came and went. Ferrari's cars began to show mechanical stress. One by one, they slowed, fell back, stopped. The GT40S held together. Shelby's preparation was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. By Sunday morning, there was nothing left to decide. Ford hadn't just beaten Ferrari, they had erased them. 3 GT40S crossed the line first, second, and third. A 1-2-3 sweep at the most prestigious race in the world. The first time in history that an American manufacturer had won Le Mans. Ferrari finished nowhere, 16 laps behind the leaders. The Italian cars that had owned this race for 6 years didn't even feature. Henry Ford II had his revenge. But inside that victory, something was rotting. A decision made in the final hour of the race that Ford has never fully reckoned with. And to understand it, you need to know who actually built that car. His name was Ken Miles, not an executive, not a committee member, a British-born racing driver who had been with Shelby from the beginning, in the car during testing, running lap after lap at Ford's test track, feeding technical data back to the engineers with a precision that most drivers couldn't provide. Ken Miles understood the GT40, Mark II at a mechanical level. He had helped shape what it became. During the 1966 race, Miles was leading. Not barely, comfortably. He had been the fastest driver all weekend, and with less than an hour left on the clock, he was on the edge of something historic. Win Le Mans, and he would complete a clean sweep of the 3 greatest endurance races in the world: Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans, in a single year. Nobody had ever done it. Nobody has done it since. Then Ford's executives made a call from the pit wall. They wanted a photo finish. All 3 GT40S crossing the line together. A perfect image, side by side, for the press. Clean. Powerful. Good for business. Good for the story Ford wanted to tell. Miles was told to slow down, to hold his position and let the other 2 cars close the gap. He did it. He was a professional. He trusted his team. He lifted off and waited. What Ford's executives either didn't know or didn't care about was what that order was going to cost him. Under Le Mans rules, finishing position is determined by where your car sits on the track when the flag falls, not by overall race time. Miles had started from further back on the grid. When the 3 cars crossed together, Miles was technically behind the other 2 on track. He was classified second, the man who had led the race, the man who had helped engineer the car. Second, the historic win, the clean sweep that would have made him one of the most celebrated drivers in motorsport history, taken from him by the same organization he had given everything to. And then it got worse. 6 weeks later, Ken Miles was killed. A testing accident at Riverside Raceway in California. A car failure at speed. He was gone. He never got another race, never got a correction, never got an acknowledgement from Ford that what happened on that finish line was wrong. His name sits in the record books in second place. The win that should have been his went to a driver who didn't even realize he had moved to first until it was over. Ford celebrated. Carroll Shelby was devastated, and Ken Miles, the man most responsible for the car that ended Ferrari's dominance, was buried without the title he had earned. Ford won Le Mans again in 1967, 1968, and 1969. 4 consecutive victories. The GT40 passed into legend. Carroll Shelby's name became permanent in the history of American motorsport. And Ferrari? On paper, they just lost. Ford won. Ferrari lost. Move on. But look at what it actually cost Enzo. After 1966, he called his chief engineer Mauro Forgave and gave him one instruction: win. What came out of that conversation was the Ferrari 330P4, low, aggressive, a 4-liter V12 that sounded less like an engine and more like something alive. Many people who have studied race cars consider it the most beautiful competition car ever made. Ferrari came back swinging in 1967 and nearly took Ford down. They didn't win Le Mans that year, but they made every lap a fight. The problem was the bill. 4 years of fighting Ford, a company with resources Ferrari couldn't match, and a personal grudge driving every decision, drained Enzo in ways that couldn't be recovered from. The money required to stay competitive, to keep rebuilding, to keep answering year after year. The relentless pressure of an opponent who had decided at the boardroom level to destroy you. It ground Ferrari down. In 1969, Enzo Ferrari sold 50% of his company to Fiat. Sit with that. The thing Enzo refused to do in 1963, surrender control of his company to an outside organization, he did in 1969. To Fiat, 6 years and 4 Le Mans defeats later, the man who walked away from $18 million rather than give Ford a say over his racing team ended up selling half his business anyway. Because the war he had started, or that had been started for him, had cost more than he could absorb. He kept the racing division. That was the one condition he never dropped. Enzo Ferrari died in August 1988, with Scuderia Ferrari still answering to him and no one else. But the company, the brand, the road cars, the business that carries his name across every continent today, was no longer fully his from 1969 onwards. The independence he had protected with such fury, such stubbornness, such willingness to burn a deal at the last second rather than compromise it. He lost it anyway. Not because he signed the wrong contract, because he walked away from one. So was the Ford GT40 the car that destroyed Ferrari? It didn't kill them. Ferrari is still here. The prancing horse is one of the most recognized symbols on Earth. The cars are still beautiful. The race team is still racing. But the Ferrari that existed before June 1966, the one that answered to nobody, that raced because Enzo wanted to race, that sold road cars as an afterthought to fund a man's obsession, that Ferrari died on a starting grid in France on a summer afternoon. All because one man refused to sign a contract, and another man refused to forgive him for it. If this story hit you the way it hits me every time I go back to it, subscribe. New video every week, real stories from the history of cars and the people who built them. And drop a comment before you leave. Tell me which side you're on. Enzo Ferrari, a man protecting the only thing he ever loved. Or Henry Ford II, a man who spent a fortune just to prove a point. Personally, I think they both won, and I think they both lost. See you in the next one.